Hey everybody, how's it going? So this is my first time doing this for the semester, so we'll just sort of see how this goes. So our next topic that we were going to talk about in class before all this stuff kind of went down, we were going to talk about the foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt, kind of look into how his presidency, again, as in domestic policy, reshaped many aspects of America's role, this time beyond our borders, globally. Um, Really, foreign policy is very essential to understanding Roosevelt. It's a part of his legacy that's a bit more complicated, perhaps, than some aspects of his domestic legacy, because um, it's where certain less favorable aspects of his character really show themselves. Um, Roosevelt, as I mentioned previously, is a very big believer in competition. It's actually a big part of the reason why he supported strong regulation of the banks, strong role for government to ensure fairness in the business world. He, again, regarded people like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, in many cases, as bad actors, people who cheated to get ahead, which, as someone who was an intensely competitive person, Roosevelt, that was just something he absolutely despised. So that's one of the reasons why he was so big into that. But the other aspect of that competitive nature of Roosevelt was the fact that he was um, a big believer in social Darwinism. He, generally speaking, was, by modern standards, a white supremacist, and believed in the superiority of Western European society, Western European culture, language, etc. And that definitely leaves a big imprint on his presidency in ways that are pretty far reaching for the United States. Uh, and you see this all the way when you start with his rise to national prominence. Um, of course, Roosevelt had risen to national prominence by literally leading a charge in a war as the commander of the Rough Riders during the Spanish American War. And even prior to that, as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the McKinley administration, he had played a critical role in bringing that war into fruition. And so that very, what's the right word I'm looking for? That very aggressive stance in terms of American foreign policy finds a very strong role in the Roosevelt administration when we look at his foreign policy. His foreign policy, generally speaking, can be summed up by a single expression: speak softly and carry a big stick. Roosevelt was a firm believer in using American military and economic power, in many cases, to strong arm and coerce less powerful countries, particularly in Latin America, into bending to America's will. And he was very strong in his belief that the United States should expand the Monroe Doctrine, exert strong influence in the Western Hemisphere in particular. But he also was a very firm believer that the U.S. should have a much larger role in foreign affairs in Europe and in particular in the Pacific. It is worth noting that the most active phase of the Philippine insurrection that we talked about a few weeks ago actually occurred during Roosevelt's presidency. So let's look at a few aspects of his foreign policy right now. Again, let's start with that expression: speak softly and carry a big stick. Roosevelt believed in a strong role for the American government in promoting foreign policy and in using, when necessary, military and economic coercion to achieve those ends. This was particularly true in Latin America, where Roosevelt's belief in racial hierarchies led him to believe generally that the people living in those countries were intellectually or socially less developed than Americans, and therefore that the United States should assume a position of leadership, even when it went against the express wishes of the peoples in those countries. And so perhaps the most graphic illustration of how Roosevelt expanded American foreign policy um, aggressively during his presidency, and really tried to put the United States on the map as not just a economic but as a military power, was in the controversies involving the construction of the Panama Canal. There's a famous expression: "A man, a plan, Panama," and Roosevelt's role in the Panama Canal is perhaps the most illustrative episode in his presidency in terms of his approach to foreign policy. Roosevelt, you may not, I may not have mentioned this before, but when he was at Harvard University, Roosevelt had written a book on the naval history of the War of 1812, which was and is still very highly regarded. And so he was a very big believer that the way for the United States to build its international reputation and to exert American power overseas was through having a powerful navy. He had, to that end, played a big role in the modernization of the U.S. Navy during the McKinley administration, prior to the Spanish-American War, which of course produced dividends during that conflict. And he was a big believer that the United States should use its naval power to enforce American commercial and political ends. To that end, Roosevelt recognized that for the United States to really exert naval power effectively, we needed to have powerful fleets in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The problem with this, of course, at the time was that there was this, kind of difficulty in transversing from one side of the world to the other, from one ocean to the other, because basically it took 6 weeks to travel down the eastern seaboard, around the tip of South America to reach the Pacific. And so Roosevelt recognized that for the U.S. to really effectively wield naval power in the Pacific effectively and the Atlantic simultaneously, the best way to do so would be to have a point in between that would facilitate the rapid movement of American military forces from one side of the world to the other. And to that end, he was very, very big in pushing the construction of the Panama Canal through the Isthmus of Panama, which is the narrowest passage between the two oceans, the two great oceans. The problem with this was there were two problems, really. The first was medical, interestingly enough. There had been an attempt to build a Panama Canal during the. Sorry, I have a little visitor who will periodically pop up in these videos, perhaps. Anyway, sorry, gotta move you out of the way, buddy. Anyway, sorry about that. So he had, the first issue was medical. There had been an attempt to build a Panama Canal during the 1880s by a French firm, but they had to stop work because of instances of malaria and yellow fever, which incidentally is also what killed the majority of Americans killed during the Spanish-American War and killed a large number of Americans during the Philippine insurrection. Actually, 10 times as many Americans died from tropical diseases as from enemy fire in those conflicts. So that had been an obstacle, the tropical diseases. But then right around the time Roosevelt becomes president, a team of Army doctors had made a breakthrough and had discovered ways of effectively treating malaria and yellow fever. And so that no longer presented as big of a problem as it had just a few years earlier. So Roosevelt really wants to push ahead with building the Panama Canal now that there's this new medical breakthrough that makes it so that it won't kill his entire workforce. Problem is, Panama is not an American territory. At the time, it was controlled by the country of Colombia. And Colombia wasn't very interested in making this territory available to the United States or anybody else for that matter, for building a canal site. And they rejected the offer made by the Roosevelt administration of $10 million to buy access and a 100-year lease on the Panama Canal Zone. And so in what's probably one of the most illustrative episodes of his presidency, Roosevelt decides, well, I'm not going to let these Colombians tell me what is going to happen, I'm going to do what's best for the country, and regardless of whether it's good for Colombia. And so what he does is, in a very short period of time, a group of New York investors who are closely linked to Roosevelt, who of course is a fixture of New York's upper, class elite, they instigate a coup in Panama, a rebellion against the Colombian authorities there. And within 24 hours of the coup being launched, the Roosevelt administration recognizes them, grants them full legitimacy, all that. And within a short period thereafter, the new Panamanian government accepts a offer for the U.S. government for some money in exchange for the right to build the Panama Canal, which work begins on pretty much immediately. So this is a clear example of what had become one of the bedrock principles of the Roosevelt foreign policy in Latin America. Latin American countries basically have a choice. They can do what the United States wants it to do, or if they do not, the United States will intervene in some capacity, either through manipulating business interests that are favorable to the U.S. in those countries, or especially after 1904, actually sending in American military forces to those countries to enforce American interests. And this becomes explicit actually just a year after the Panama incident, when Roosevelt issues what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now remember, the Monroe Doctrine had stated that the Western Hemisphere, including all of Latin America, that was not under European control, was considered basically an American sphere of influence. And so what Roosevelt's corollary does is it expands the definition of what that means. No longer does the Monroe Doctrine simply mean the U.S. is not going to let European colonial powers intervene in the affairs of Latin American countries and threaten to go to war with them if they do. It now means if Latin American countries themselves take actions that are considered counter to American interests, that the United States reserves the right to intervene in those countries' affairs, in some cases to actually overthrow their governments, and to basically use the threat of military force to get those countries to fall in line, essentially. And we begin doing so in ever increasing frequency, starting during the Roosevelt administration for the next 30 years, all the way up until, ironically enough, the presidency of his distant cousin Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. The United States would wage a series of what would come to be known as banana wars, conflicts fought against various rebel groups in Latin American countries where American business interests had very strong rationales for intervening. And so you'll see American interventions in a variety of Latin American countries, Haiti in particular, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. The list is pretty long. But between 1904 and 1934, the U.S. would fight literally dozens of small conflicts in Latin America to enforce American interests in that part of the world. And this is ultimately one of the more troubling legacies of the Roosevelt presidency, is this, very aggressive and ultimately a kind of bullying behavior towards these oftentimes very, militarily and economically weak countries in Latin America, with the use of American military force and economic coercion to get them to basically toe the line, to do what the United States wants them to do. And that's, again, something that begins under Roosevelt and becomes a fixture of American foreign policy for the next 3 decades, under both Republican and Democratic presidents alike. So that's a very important aspect of that. Now, beyond Latin America, which is the principal focus of Roosevelt's foreign policy and the explicit kind of focus of the Roosevelt corollary. Roosevelt is very interested in just generally making the United States a more well-regarded, more um, a big player, if you will, in international politics. And so while he doesn't take quite as explicit actions in other parts of the world as he does in Latin America with the Panama Canal affair or with the beginning of the banana wars in Latin American countries, he does play a pretty aggressive role in promoting American affairs. Partly this is through diplomacy. Roosevelt spearheads negotiations behind a number of treaties during this time period to prevent wars between European powers like France and Germany in 1905. The following year, he actually becomes the first American president to become a recipient of the Nobel Prize when he negotiates a treaty that ends a war in the Far East in the modern day China and the Korean Peninsula between Russia and Japan. Japan was probably, other than Latin America, Roosevelt's most special area of emphasis. Roosevelt actually had a great deal of respect for the Japanese, who had undergone a rapid economic transformation from basically a medieval society in the 1850s to a fully modern industrial powerhouse in the span of less than 30 years. By the turn of the century, by the time that Roosevelt is the president, Japan is increasingly not just a ascendant economic power, but also wants to itself, like the United States, join the club, so to speak, and wants to become an imperial power in its own right, which is, of course, why Japan and Russia got into a conflict with one another in northeastern Asia, the Russo-Japanese War. But of course, Japan's ascendancy is seen by Roosevelt as threatening to America's own ascendancy in the Pacific. And so Roosevelt wants to tread very carefully with the Japanese. He doesn't want them pushing too far in Asia, in China in particular, in a manner that'll interfere with American business interests there. But he's not going to challenge them outright militarily because they are actually pretty strong in this department. And so, once again, living up to that idea of speak softly and carry a big stick, what Roosevelt does with the Japanese is he engages in what today is known as power projection. He sends a fleet of the most up-to-date American warships he can assemble, 16 battleships, calls them the Great White Fleet, which the name itself is actually not an accident. It's not just because of the color of the ships, but also, again, the Great White Fleet to an extent. But Roosevelt sends his fleet on a so-called goodwill mission to the Far East, to Tokyo Harbor. And the purpose of this is actually quite obvious to everybody. It's basically a way of saying, don't mess with us. Look at these warships we've got. Look at this power we can project in this part of the world. This is what you're going to be up against if you push your boundaries too far. And so this is, I think, a pivotal moment in 20th century geopolitics because it actually marks the beginning of the increasing competition between the United States and the Japanese that'll eventually culminate in with Japan attacking the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, and the Pacific theater of the Second World War. So the roots of that conflict, actually, you can trace it back all the way to the decisions made during the Theodore Roosevelt administration in the early 20th century. So it's really, again, I think very interesting when you look at it that way. So that's all I wanted to talk about for the foreign policy. The next video I'm going to post, we're going to talk about another aspect of Roosevelt's presidency, which is going to be his focus on conservation and basically being the most environmentally conscious president in American history.